Welcome to the sixth and final session of Second Maccabees, an introduction to the Apocrypha. In this session, we learn about the death of Menelaus and the installation of a new high priest. And we read about the return of Nicanor, who we last heard from in chapter 8, when his plans to capture and sell the Jews as slaves went awry. There are some more battles in these chapters and finally some closure. But first, we begin with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So this is our last session, and perhaps this is a good time for disclaimers and explanations. I've utilized multiple sources in this study. I've used Daniel Harrington's commentary, First and Second Maccabees, a part of the New Collegeville Bible Commentary Series. I've also used the new Oxford Annotated Apocrypha, revised 4th edition. And I've used the First and Second Books of Maccabees commentary by John R. Bartlett, a Cambridge Bible commentary on the New English Bible. Nearly all of the commentary provided in this study came from one of those sources. Much of it directly quoted, although in some cases I paraphrased. I may have made errors in interpreting some of the commentary I used, but have not done so intentionally. We have primarily used the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, or the updated NRSV, which is not all that different from the other translations that you might have available, like the NIV, the CEB, the New English Bible, the New American Bible, or the New King James. We have occasionally quoted from the New English Bible translation, in which we have noted some minor differences. For example, the NRSV uses the name Timothy, while the NEB uses Timotheus, but pretty much they're the same. It's also true that biblical scholars don't always agree on the interpretation of some biblical passages, so the dates may not always match up, or one commentator may infer different motives behind a particular action. I have generally tried to be consistent within the context of any particular storyline, even where two commentators disagree on some point or motive. For example, Antiochus IV Eupator was young when his father died, but some sources say he was about 6 years old, others 9, and again others say he was about 12 years old. In reality, no one knows, so for purposes of this study, I assume that he was about 6 or 8. There are even occasional spelling differences from one translation or one commentator to another. The New English Bible spells the name Maccabeus differently than the NRSV. Finally, in the text, Judas is referred to as Judas Maccabeus, but nowhere in either book do we find the whole family identified as the Maccabees, or for that matter, the Hasmoneans, although historically this family has been referred to as the Hasmonean dynasty. So we begin today with chapter 13, verse 1. In the 149th year, word came to Judas and his men that Antiochus Eupator was coming with a great army against Judea, and with him Lysias, his guardian, who had charge of the government. Each of them had a Greek force of 110,000 infantry, 5,300 cavalry, 22 elephants, and 300 chariots armed with scythes. This chapter, which makes no allusion to chapter 11 and the letters from Lysias and Antiochus Eupator about making peace with the Jews, tells about another campaign, this time focusing on Beth Zur. The year we are told was 149, so this was probably the fall of 163 BCE. Menelaus also joined them with utter hypocrisy, urged Antiochus on, not for the sake of his country's welfare, but because he thought he would be established in office. But the King of Kings aroused the anger of Antiochus against the scoundrel, and when Lysias informed him that this man was to blame for all the trouble, he ordered them to take him to Beroa and put him to death by the method that is customary in that place. For there is a tower there, 50 cubits high, full of ashes, and it has a rim running around it that on all sides inclines precipitously into the ashes. There they all push to destruction anyone guilty of sacrilege or notorious for other crimes. By such a fate it came about that Menelaus the lawbreaker died without even burial in the earth, and this was eminently just, because he had committed many sins against the altar, whose fire and ashes were holy. He met his death in ashes. So this interlude helps take care of some loose ends. It helps explain here that Antiochus was informed that Menelaus was to blame for all the trouble, though we're not given any specific problems that Menelaus has caused for the Suppliants. The method of death being dropped into ashes was a Persian practice. We are not told whether the ashes that Menelaus was pushed into were hot, so that Menelaus died by burning, or cold, so that he died by suffocation. It's not clear. Again, we hear about a villain's death being poetic justice. The apparent artificiality of this explanation in this case, however, is nothing else, shows how important the notion of poetic justice is for the author. Sins against the altar, whose fire and ashes were holy. But we're not given any specific instance of these sins. He was a priest and must have had something to do with burnt sacrifices. Our author wanted to say that this was poetic justice, and holy ashes was probably the best he could do. So we go on. The king, with barbarous arrogance, was coming to show the Jews things far worse than those that had been done in his father's time. But when Judas heard of this, he ordered the people to call upon the Lord day and night, now if ever, to help those who were on the point of being deprived of the law and their country and the holy temple, and not to let the people who had just begun to revive fall into the hands of the blasphemous nations. When they had all joined in the same petition and implored the merciful Lord with weeping and fasting and lying prostrate for 3 days without ceasing, Judas exhorted them and ordered them to stand ready. After consulting privately with the elders, he determined to march out and decide the matter by the help of God before the king's army could enter Judea and get possession of the city. So, committing the decision to the Creator of the world and exhorting his troops to fight bravely to the death for the laws, temple, city, country, and way of life, he pitched his camp near Modin. He gave his troops the watchword, God's victory, and with a picked force of the bravest young men, he attacked the king's pavilion at night and killed as many as 2,000 men in the camp. He stabbed the leading elephant and its rider. In the end, they filled the camp with terror and confusion and withdrew in triumph. This happened just as the day was dawning, because the Lord's help protected him. We read here a couple of times that Judas was fighting for law, temple, and country. Perhaps Jewish country mattered a little less than the other two, but the idea of land as an inheritance from God was and is important to Judaism. Judas again takes the initiative and moves north to keep the Syrians away from the temple and the citadel. Modin was the hometown of the Maccabean family, and it lay on the edge of the plain of Ajalon, which was the obvious route into Judea for an army coming south down the coastal plain. We go on to verse 18. The king, having had a taste of the daring of the Jews, tried strategy in attacking their positions. He advanced against Beth-zur, a strong fortress of the Jews, was turned back, attacked again, and was defeated. Judas sent into the garrison whatever was necessary. But Rhodocus, a man from the ranks of the Jews, gave secret information to the enemy. He was sought for, caught, and put in prison. The king negotiated a second time with the people in Beth-zur, gave pledges, received theirs, withdrew, attacked Judas and his men, and was defeated. He got word that Philip, who had been left in charge of the government, had revolted in Antioch. He was dismayed, called in the Jews, yielded and swore to observe all their rites, settled with them and offered sacrifice, honored the sanctuary, and showed generosity to the holy place. He received Maccabeus, left Hegemonides as governor from Ptolemais to Ger, and went to the Ptolemies. The people of Ptolemais were indignant over the treaty. In fact, they were so angry that they wanted to annul its terms. Lysias took the public platform and made the best possible defense, convinced them, appeased them, gained their goodwill, and set out for Antioch. This is how the king's attack and withdrawal turned out. So much of this passage parallels 1 Maccabees chapter 6, where Beth-sur was besieged and capitulated. But here, Judas is successful in getting supplies to the garrison, and the Syrian attacks are repulsed. In both cases, the siege ended with an agreement. Verse 23, which says that Philip had been left in charge of the government in Antioch and revolted, is somewhat confusing. Chapter 9, verse 29 previously told us that Philip had fled to Egypt out of fear of Eupator. The story we read in 1 Maccabees tells us that Lysias heard that Philip and his army were approaching Antioch shortly after the death of Antiochus IV. Lysias decides to return to Antioch in order to defend it from Philip's forces. Because of this urgent need to return, he quickly reaches an agreement with Judas and heads out of town. So we move on to chapter 14. 3 years later, word came to Judas and his men that Demetrius, son of Suclius, had sailed into the harbor of Tripolis with a strong army and a fleet, and they had taken possession of the country, having made away with Antiochus and his guardian Lysias. So Demetrius, son of Suclius, had been a young boy in 175 when his father was assassinated. He was sent to Rome as a hostage in exchange for Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, as a young man, he had escaped from Rome and landed in Tripolis on the coast of northern Lebanon in 162. From there, he took a small army and returned to Antioch to take over the government he saw as rightfully his. He had Lysias and the young king Antiochus Eupator killed. So we go on verse 3. Now a certain Alcimus, who had formerly been high priest, but had willfully defiled himself in the days of separation, realized that there was no way for him to be safe or to have access again to the holy altar, and went to King Demetrius in about the 151st year, presenting to him a crown of gold and a palm, and besides these, some of the customary olive branches from the temple. During that day he kept quiet, but he found an opportunity that furthered his mad purpose when he was invited by Demetrius to a meeting of the council and was asked about the attitude and intentions of the Jews. He answered, "Those of the Jews who are called Hasidians, whose leader is Judas Maccabeus, are keeping up war and stirring up sedition, and will not let the kingdom attain tranquility. Therefore I have laid aside my ancestral glory, I mean the high priesthood, and I have now come here, first because I am genuinely concerned for the interests of the king, and second because I have regard also for my compatriots. For through the folly of those whom I have mentioned, our whole nation is now in no small misfortune. Since you are acquainted, O king, with the details of this matter, may it please you to take thought for our country and our hard-pressed nation with the gracious kindness that you show to all. For as long as Judas lives, it is impossible for the government to find peace." When he had said this, the rest of the king's friends who were hostile to Judas quickly inflamed Demetrius still more. He immediately chose Nicanor, who had been in command of the elephants, appointed him governor of Judea, and sent him off with orders to kill Judas and scatter his troops, and to install Alcimus as high priest to the great temple. And the nations throughout Judea who had fled before Judas flocked to join Nicanor, thinking that the misfortunes and calamities of the Jews would mean prosperity for themselves. So in verse 6, we're told that Alcimus had formerly been high priest. Alcimus may have been appointed high priest after the death of Menelaus. If so, he must have lost that position, and appealing to the new king Demetrius I, he wants the high priesthood back. Alcimus incites the new king against Judas, and Demetrius sends Nicanor back to Judea. In verse 6, Alcimus refers to Judas as the leader of the Hasidians. There was such a group of pious peace-seeking Jews called Hasidians, but Judas Maccabeus was not part of that group and certainly not their leader. In 1 Maccabees, it was Bacchides who Demetrius first sent to Judea, but here it was Nicanor. So we go on to verse 15. When the Jews heard of Nicanor's coming and the gathering of the nations, they sprinkled dust on their heads, prayed to him who established his own people forever and always upholds his own heritage by manifesting himself. At the command of the leader, they set out from there immediately and engaged him in battle in a village called Deso. Simon, the brother of Judas, has encountered Nicanor, but had been temporarily checked because of the sudden consternation created by the enemy. Nevertheless, Nicanor, hearing of the valor of Judas and his troops and their courage in battle for their country, shrank from deciding the issue by bloodshed. Therefore he sent Posadonus, Theodas, and Matthias to give and receive pledges of friendship. When the terms had been fully considered and the leader had informed the people, and it had appeared that there was of one mind, they agreed to the covenant. The leaders set a day on which to meet by themselves. A chariot came forward from each army. Seats of honor were set in place. Judas posted armed men in readiness at key places to prevent sudden treachery on the part of the enemy. So they duly held the consultation. In the New English Bible and the New American Bible, it says that Nicanor met the Jews in battle at the village of Adasa. In the New Revised Standard Version, it uses the name Dasau, which is probably a corrupt Greek version of the same name. In any event, it is unclear where the battle was actually fought. There is also a reference to Simon having lost a battle to Nicanor, but again, not clear when or where exactly that was. We go on with verse 23. Nicanor stayed on in Jerusalem and did nothing out of the way, but dismissed the flocks of people who had gathered. And he kept Judas always in his presence, and he was warmly attached to the man. He urged him to marry and have children, so Judas married, settled down, and shared a common life. But when Alcimus noticed their goodwill for one another, he took the covenant that had been made and went to Demetrius. He told him that Nicanor was disloyal to the government, since he had appointed the conspirator against the kingdom, Judas, to be his successor. The king became excited and provoked by the false accusations of the depraved man, wrote to Nicanor stating that he was displeased with the covenant and commanding him to send Maccabeus to Antioch as a prisoner without delay. So this claim is remarkable, that Nicanor developed a personal friendship with Judas. Nothing in 1 Maccabees would suggest anything like a friendship between the two. We go on to verse 28. When this message came to Nicanor, he was troubled and grieved that he had to annul their agreement when the man had done no wrong. Since it was not possible to oppose the king, he watched for an opportunity to accomplish this by stratagem. But Maccabeus, noticing that Nicanor was more austere in his dealings with him and was meeting with him more rudely than had been his custom, concluded that this austerity did not spring from the best motives. So he gathered not a few of his men and went into hiding from Nicanor. When the latter became aware that he had been cleverly outwitted by the man, he went to the great and holy temple while the priests were offering the customary sacrifices, and commanded them to hand the man over. When they declared on oath that they did not know where the man was whom he wanted, he stretched out his right hand toward the sanctuary and swore this oath: "If you do not hand Judas over to me as a prisoner, I will level this shrine of God to the ground and tear down the altar and build here a splendid temple to Dionysus." So we're told that Nicanor was caught in a box here. He saw no fault with Judas, but the king was the king, and there was no way of opposing the king. Judas, recognizing this sudden coldness, went into hiding. Nicanor threatened to tear down the temple if the Jews wouldn't hand Judas over to him. He would build a shrine to Dionysus. Having said this, he went away. Then the priests stretched out their hands toward heaven and called upon the constant defender of our nation in these words: "O Lord of all, though you have need of nothing, you are pleased that there should be a temple for your habitation among us. So now, O Holy One, Lord of all holiness, keep undefiled forever this house that has been so recently purified." The priests were defiant and called on the Lord for help. Now, at the end of this chapter, we hear another martyr story. A certain Razus, one of the elders of Jerusalem, was denounced to Nicanor as a man who loved his compatriots and was very well thought of for his goodwill, was called Father of the Jews. For before the days of separation, he had been accused of Judaism and had most zealously risked body and life for Judaism. Nicanor, wishing to exhibit the enmity that he had for the Jews, sent more than 500 soldiers to arrest him, for he thought that by arresting him, he would do them an injury. When the troops were about to capture the tower and were forcing the door of the courtyard, they ordered that fire be brought and the doors burned. Being surrounded, Razus fell upon his own sword, preferring to die nobly rather than to fall into the hands of sinners and suffer outrages unworthy of his noble birth. But in the heat of the struggle, he did not hit exactly, and the crowd was now rushing in through the doors. He courageously ran up on the wall and bravely threw himself down into the crowd. But as they quickly drew back, a space opened, and he fell in the middle of an empty space. Still alive and aflame with anger, he rose, and though blood gushed forth and his wounds were severe, he ran through the crowd, and standing upon a steep rock, with blood now completely drained from him, he tore out his entrails, took them in both hands, and hurled them at the crowd, calling upon the Lord of life and spirit to give them back to him again. This was the manner of his death. So at the very end, Razus undertook suicide out of his own conviction that in the resurrection, he would get his body parts back. Now we go on to chapter 15. When Nicanor heard that Judas and his troops were in the region of Samaria, he made plans to attack them with complete safety on the day of rest. When the Jews who were compelled to follow him said, "Do not destroy savagely and barbarously, but show respect for the day on that he who sees all things has honored and hallowed above other days," the thrice accursed wretch asked if there were a sovereign in heaven who had commanded the keeping of the Sabbath day. When they declared, "It is the living Lord himself, the sovereign in heaven, who ordered us to observe the seventh day," he replied, "But I am sovereign also on earth, and I command you to take up arms and finish the king's business." Nevertheless, he did not succeed in carrying out his abominable design. This Nicanor, in his utter boastfulness and arrogance, had determined to erect a public monument of victory over Judas and his forces. But Maccabeus did not cease to trust with all confidence that he would get help from the Lord. He exhorted his troops not to fear the attack of the nations, but to keep in mind the former times when help had come to them from heaven, and so to look for the victory that the Almighty would give them, encouraging them from the law and the prophets, and reminding them also of the struggles they had won. He made them the more eager. When he had aroused their courage, he issued his orders, at the same time pointing out the treachery of nations and the violations of oaths. He armed each of them not so much with confidence in shields and spears, as with an inspiration of brave words. And he cheered them all by relating a dream, a sort of vision, that was worthy of belief. So here we see a Nicanor who has become extremely arrogant, perhaps in his frustration with the Jewish people. "But I am sovereign also on earth, and I command you." The author here is clearly showing Nicanor as a bragging blasphemer. Judas, in contrast, told his troops to be confident in the Lord. Verse 12. What he saw was this: Onias, who had been high priest, a noble good man of modest bearing and gentle manner, one who spoke fittingly and who had been trained from childhood in all that belongs to excellence, was praying with outstretched hands for the whole body of the Jews. Then in the same fashion another appeared, distinguished by his gray hair and dignity, and of marvelous majesty and authority. And Onias spoke, saying, "This is a man who loves the family of Israel and prays much for the people in the holy city, Jeremiah, the prophet of God." Jeremiah stretched out his right hand and gave to Judas a golden sword, and as he gave it, he addressed him thus: "Take this holy sword, a gift from God, with which you will strike down your adversaries." Encouraged by the words of Judas, so noble and so effective in arousing valor and awakening courage in the souls of the young, They determined not to carry on a campaign, but to attack bravely and to decide the matter by fighting hand to hand with all courage, because the city and the sanctuary and the temple were in danger. Their concern for wives and children, and also for brothers and sisters and relatives, lay upon them less heavily. Their greatest and first fear was for the consecrated sanctuary, and those who had to remain in the city were in no little distress, being anxious over the encounter in the open country. So none of this material is found in First Maccabees. Second Maccabees devotes a great deal of space and dramatic art to the Jewish spiritual preparations for battle, for the author sees this battle as the grand climax of Judah's career. So now the battle begins. Verse 20. When all were now looking forward to the coming issue, and the enemy was already close at hand with their army drawn up for battle, the elephants strategically stationed, and the cavalry deployed on the flanks, Maccabeus, observing the masses that were in front of him and the varied supply of arms and savagery of the elephants, stretched out his hands toward heaven and called upon the Lord who works wonders. For he knew that it was not by arms, but as the Lord decides, that he gains the victory for those who deserve it. He called upon him in these words: O Lord, you sent your angel in the time of King Hezekiah of Judah, and he killed fully 185,000 in the camp of Shinnebar. So now, O sovereign of the heavens, send a good angel to spread terror and trembling before us. By the might of your arm, may these blasphemers who come against your holy people be struck down. With these words, he ended his prayer. Nicanor and his troops advanced with trumpets and battle songs, but Judas and his troops met the enemy in battle with invocations and prayers. So, fighting with their hands and praying to God in their hearts, they laid low at least 35,000 and were greatly gladdened by God's manifestation. We see the contrast between the Syrians who trust in their troops, cavalry, elephants, and equipment, and advance with trumpets and war songs, and the Jews who trust in God and join battle with invocations and prayers. The battle itself is summarized in verse 27 very quickly. Verse 28. When the action was over and they were returning with joy, they recognized Nicanor lying dead in full armor. Then there was shouting and tumult, and they blessed the sovereign Lord in the language of their ancestors. Then the man who was ever in body and soul the defender of his people, the man who maintained his youthful goodwill toward his compatriots, ordered them to cut off Nicanor's head and arm and carry them to Jerusalem. When he arrived there and had called his compatriots together and stationed the priests before the altar, he sent for those who were in the citadel. He showed them the vile Nicanor's head and that profane man's arm, which had been boastfully stretched out against the holy house of the Almighty. He cut out the tongue of the ungodly Nicanor and said that he would feed it piecemeal to the birds and would hang up these rewards of his folly opposite the sanctuary. And they all, looking to heaven, blessed the Lord, who had manifested himself, saying, Blessed is he who has kept his own place undefiled. Judas hung Nicanor's head from the citadel, a clear and conspicuous sign to everyone of the help of the Lord. And they all decreed by public vote never to let this day go unobserved, but to celebrate the 13th day of the 12th month, which is called Adar in the Aramaic language, the day before Mordecai's day. So the author ends his work with the death of Nicanor and the establishment of a festival to mark that event. This then is how matters turned out with Nicanor, and from that time this city has been in the possession of the Hebrews. So I will end my story. If it is well told and to the point, that is what I myself desired. If it is poorly done and mediocre, that was the best I could do. For just as it is harmful to drink wine alone, or again to drink water alone, while wine already mixed with water is delicious and enhances one's enjoyment, so also the style of the story delights the ears of those who read the work. And here will be the end. So the author's conclusion lines up with his preface here. We have pointed out repeatedly that the author has literary rather than academic pretensions. He appears to want to charm the ear off of the reader rather than to satisfy his curiosity. We have said that this is a pathetic history, a history concerned with stirring emotions. It emphasizes the role of God in protecting his people. As evidence for the history of the Maccabean period, this work is valuable, but it must be used with care. If we are interested in an accurate chronological history of events, First Maccabees is probably a much better choice. The Second Book of Maccabees gives us an historical account of a major rebellion of the Jewish people that we read nothing about anywhere in the Old or New Testament. For hundreds of years prior to the mid-2nd century BCE, Judah or Israel has been a vassal state, paying tribute to some king or emperor from a foreign land. The Jews of Judea were perhaps in danger of being Hellenized out of existence in 165 BCE when Judas Maccabeus led a rebellion to save the Jerusalem temple, the ancient Jewish law code, and the Jewish way of life. For about 100 years, they remained an independent political and religious entity. This study has been the 9th in a series that Northgate United Methodist Church has offered on the books of the Apocrypha. We have now completed all of the Apocrypha deuterocanonical books and editions included in the Roman Catholic canon. There remain a half dozen others that are part of the Greek or Slavonic canons or are included in the indexes of one or more of those Bibles. As always, I appreciate your comments and suggestions, which you can give me either directly or you can email them to online.classes@northgateumc.org. Thank you.